The sky had bled out. What began as a hazy saffron smudge on the western horizon that morning had, by late afternoon, curdled into a bruised and violent crimson that pressed down on the valley, stealing the very breath from the air. The heat was a physical presence, a malevolent entity that shimmered above the parched earth and warped the familiar lines of the distant pines into drunken, wavering specters. It was a dry, biblical heat that promised not life, but annihilation. Clarabelle stood at the single glass pane window of their small cabin, the rough-hewn wood of the sill hot beneath her forearms. In her arms, the small, warm weight of her daughter Mercy was both an anchor and a stone. The baby's heartbeat, a frantic, tiny drum against Clarabelle's own thunderous pulse, was the only rhythm left in a world that had lost its senses. Smoke, acrid and resinous, clawed at the back of her throat, a taste of burnt sugar and grief. Each breath was a choice, a sharp, deliberate pull against the thickening atmosphere that burned from her sinuses down to the pit of her stomach. She could see it now, not just smell it. A rolling, monstrous wave of orange and black devouring the ridgeline, moving with an unnatural, predatory speed. It didn't just burn the forest, it consumed it, leaving a void of charcoal and ash in its wake. The roar was no longer a distant whisper, but a constant, low growl that vibrated through the soles of her worn leather boots and up into her bones. They were alone. James, her husband, had been gone 3 weeks, having ridden to Fort Laramie for supplies and seed for the coming spring, a spring that now seemed a laughable fiction. "I'll be back before the first snow flies, Clara," he'd promised, his hand calloused and warm on her cheek. "You and the little one hold the fort." His absence, once a dull ache of loneliness, was now a screaming void, a source of both her terror and her desperate, clawing motivation. There was no one coming for them. The nearest neighbor, Silas Ward, was a good 10 miles east, on the other side of the creek and another ridge. The fire was between them. It was all between them. Mercy stirred against her, a small whimper escaping her rosebud lips. Clarabelle looked down, her gaze tracing the impossibly fine pale hair on her daughter's head. 8 months old, a lifetime of trusting innocence bundled in flannel and her mother's arms. Mercy's eyes fluttered open, 2 chips of startling blue in the smoke-dimmed light. They held no fear, only a placid, unwavering trust that shattered Clarabelle's heart into 1,000 pieces. How could she protect that trust against a godless inferno? Her mind, a frantic hornet's nest of fear, raced through the impossible options. Stay in the cabin, a tinderbox, a pre-made pyre, run for the creek? It was a mile through the woods that were already beginning to smoke and crackle. The fire was faster than she was, especially carrying a child. The root cellar? A damp, dark hole, a potential oven, suffocation if not incineration. Every thought was a dead end, a path leading to the same scorched conclusion. Her gaze drifted past the window, to the small corral beside the cabin. And there he was, Tobias, their old donkey. He stood perfectly still, his long ears swiveling, his coat the color of dust and patience. He wasn't panicked. While the wild things of the forest, the deer, the rabbits, the birds, had long since fled in a silent, desperate exodus, Tobias remained. He stood with a stolid, unnerving calm, his dark, liquid eyes fixed on the approaching wall of flame as if in assessment. Tobias, who had carried their plow, their sacks of flour, their worldly goods across the plains, a beast of burden, a dumb animal. And yet, in his stillness, Clarabelle saw something else, a steadiness that the world had lost. An idea, terrifying and monstrous in its logic, began to form in the smoke-addled recesses of her mind. It was a choice that felt like a betrayal, a violation of every maternal instinct that screamed at her to hold her child, to never let go. But the fire was a relentless truth, and it did not care for instinct. It cared only for fuel. She looked from Mercy's trusting blue eyes to the donkey's steady gaze, and then back to the blood-red sky. The cabin groaned, a timber settling as the heat intensified. The world was ending, and there was no room for sentiment. There was only the brutal calculus of survival. She had to choose, not between life and death, but between two different, unimaginable ways of letting go. The roar of the fire was a voice now, whispering a terrible gospel of speed and separation. The decision once made settled in her gut like a cold stone. There was no more time for debate, no more room for the luxury of terror. A switch flipped inside her, and the panicked mother was supplanted by something harder, more primal. She moved with a purpose that felt borrowed, her actions sharp and economical. She laid Mercy gently on the rough-spun blanket of their bed, the baby's blue eyes following her every move. "It's all right, my love," Clarabelle whispered, her voice a raw, cracked thing. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She grabbed another thick wool blanket, the one James had favored, the one that still smelled faintly of him, of pine and sweat and earth. It was a shroud, a shield. She worked quickly, her fingers clumsy with haste. She wrapped Mercy snugly, leaving only a small opening for her face, swaddling her not against a chill but against a furnace. The baby gurgled, content in her cocoon. Outside, the air was a blast furnace. The heat slapped her face, drying the tears on her cheeks before they had a chance to fall. Tobias didn't flinch as she approached. He simply turned his great shaggy head and looked at her, his gaze so profound, so knowing, it felt like a judgment. "Tobias," she said, her voice strained. "Old friend, I need you." She stroked the coarse hair between his ears, a silent plea passing from her hand to his skin. He blinked slowly, a gesture of solemn acceptance. He was more than a work animal now. He was an ark. He was the only vessel that could carry her precious cargo through the coming flood of fire. She looped the reins over the corral fence and led him to the mounting block beside the cabin wall. He stood, patient as a statue, as she performed the terrible, necessary act. She took the wrapped bundle that was her daughter and, with practiced hands that knew the art of securing loads, began to strap her to the donkey's broad, sturdy back. She used strips of soft leather, cinching them not against the hard edges of a crate, but against the soft, yielding form of her child. She worked the straps under his belly, creating a secure harness, a makeshift saddle of salvation. With every knot she tied, a piece of her soul seemed to unravel. This was wrong. It was an abomination. A mother did not strap her baby to a beast and send it into the wilderness. But the alternative, the image of them both turning to ash in each other's arms, was a spur that drove her on. She checked the knots again and again, pulling until her knuckles were white. Secure, but not too tight. Stable. Mercy was facing backward, away from the direction he would travel, shielded by the bulk of his body. Clarabelle leaned in close, pressing her cheek against her daughter's swaddled form, inhaling the sweet, milky scent of her one last time. "Be brave, my heart," she murmured into the wool. "Tobias will keep you safe. He will take you to the creek. Mama will find you. Mama will find you." It was a prayer, a promise, a desperate lie she willed into truth. She looked into Mercy's eyes, a final, searing glance at that perfect, innocent blue. Then she pulled the blanket flap over her daughter's face, plunging her world into darkness. Her hand trembled as she gave Tobias a final pat. She looked into his dark, ancient eyes. "Go," she commanded, her voice breaking. "To the water, boy. Go now. Hiya!" She slapped his flank, a sharp, resonant sound that was immediately swallowed by the roar of the approaching inferno. For a heart-stopping second, the donkey didn't move. He simply stood there, a strange, still monument in a world of chaos. Then, as if coming to a decision of his own, he lowered his head, turned, and began to walk. Not a panicked bolt, but a steady, deliberate pace. He moved away from the cabin, away from her, and headed not directly for the creek, but angled north, toward a shallow ravine that offered a slightly more sheltered path. It was a path she hadn't considered. A smarter path. He navigated the terrain with an uncanny wisdom, his hooves sure and steady on the dry, cracking earth. Clarabelle watched until the gray form, carrying the most precious thing in her world, was swallowed by the swirling smoke and the deepening twilight of the firestorm. She was alone, truly alone. But her task was not done. A new desperation, cold and sharp, seized her. The strongbox. Tucked beneath a loose floorboard under their bed was the heavy iron box that held everything they owned of value. The deed to their land, the small pouch of gold coins James had painstakingly saved, her mother's locket, their marriage certificate. It was their past, and their only hope for a future. It was the reason James had gone for supplies, the foundation upon which they would rebuild, if rebuilding was even possible. To abandon it was to say that survival was enough, that a life without memory or means was a life worth living. Her exhausted mind screamed that it was. Just run. Follow the donkey. Nothing else matters. But the part of her that was James's wife, the part of her that was a builder of a home, not just a bearer of a child, refused. The strongbox was the crushing weight of practical survival, a tangible link to the world they had tried to create. It was a future for the baby she had just sent away. With a sob that was half gasp, half war cry, she turned and sprinted back toward the cabin. The porch was already smoldering. A lick of flame, bright and hungry, curled up a support post like a serpent. She didn't hesitate. She threw herself through the doorway into a room that was now a choking, hellish haze. The heat was immense, a solid wall that seared her lungs. Smoke billowed in thick, oily clouds, reducing visibility to inches. The world was a symphony of destruction, the sharp crack of splitting wood, the hiss of sap boiling in the logs, the deep guttural whoosh of the fire finding new purchase in the roof. She dropped to her hands and knees, the floorboards hot enough to raise blisters on her palms. Crawling by memory, she navigated past the overturned rocking chair, the scattered pewter plates from the table. Her eyes streamed, blinded by the smoke. She found the bedpost, her anchor in the chaos, and scrabbled at the floorboards beneath it. One was loose. She dug her fingers into the crack, ignoring the splintering wood and the searing heat, and pulled. It gave way with a screech of tortured nails. There it was, the cold, dark iron of the strongbox. She hooked her fingers under the handle and pulled. It was heavier than she remembered, an anchor of worldly concerns in a moment of elemental fury. Hoisting it into the crook of her arm, she turned to escape, but the doorway was no longer a doorway. It was a shimmering curtain of orange flame, a solid wall of fire. The roof above her groaned, a long, terrible sound of surrender. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She was trapped. She had made her impossible choice, traded her child for a box of metal and paper, and now she would lose both. She would die here, clutching the ghost of a future, while her baby faced the inferno alone. It was a fool's errand, a final, fatal miscalculation. The weight in her arm was no longer a symbol of hope, but a tombstone. Clarabelle stumbled out of the collapsing inferno that had been her home, not through the door, but through the window frame she had shattered with the corner of the heavy iron box. She fell, rather than climbed, onto the scorched earth outside, landing hard on her shoulder. The cool night air, still thick with smoke but blessedly free of the concentrated heat of the cabin, was a shock to her seared lungs. She coughed, a deep, retching sound that tore at her raw throat, spitting black phlegm onto the dust. Her hair was singed, the skin on her forearms and hands a screaming tapestry of blisters. The strongbox, clutched tight against her chest, had left a rectangular brand of heat through her dress. But she was out. She was alive. The cabin behind her gave a final shuddering groan and imploded, sending a geyser of sparks and embers soaring into the blood-red sky. It was gone. Everything they had built, gone in a plume of smoke. Pushing herself to her knees, then shakily to her feet, her wild eyes searched the area where she had last seen him. The corral was a skeleton of blackened poles, the gate gaping open. But the space beyond it was empty, utterly, terrifyingly empty. "Tobias?" she croaked, the name a shard of glass in her throat. The world went silent. The roar of the fire, the crackle of burning timber, the frantic pounding of her own heart, it all faded into a dull, distant hum. All she could hear was the ringing in her ears, a high, thin sound of absolute emptiness. He was gone. Mercy was gone. "No," she whispered, the word a puff of air devoid of conviction. "No, no, no." She began to stumble forward, her movements jerky, uncoordinated. Her gaze swept the smoke-choked clearing, desperate for a sign, a flicker of movement, the shape of a donkey against the fiery backdrop. There was nothing. Only the dancing demons of the fire and the skeletal remains of her life. The logic of her choice, so cold and clear just moments before, now revealed itself as monstrous folly. She had sent her baby, her helpless 8-month-old daughter, into a world of flame on the back of a donkey, a dumb animal. What had she been thinking? That he possessed some magical wisdom? That he understood the gravity of his charge? He was an animal, ruled by instinct, and the instinct of every creature in this valley was to flee in blind panic. He would have bolted, run blindly until the precious bundle was scraped from his back by a low-hanging branch, or until he stumbled, or until the fire simply overtook him. A wave of nausea, so profound it buckled her knees, washed over her. She dropped the strongbox. It landed with a heavy final thud in the ash, the sound of a closing casket. She sank to the ground beside it, her body convulsing with dry, silent sobs. This was it. The emotional floor of the world. She had not saved her child. She had sacrificed her. For what? For a box of metal. For a deed to a plot of land that was now a smoking ruin. For a future that would never come. The weight of her failure was absolute, a physical pressure that crushed the air from her lungs and pinned her to the scorched earth. She had made an impossible choice, and she had chosen wrong. The image of Mercy's trusting blue eyes burned behind her eyelids, a relentless accusation. She had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way imaginable. She had traded her daughter's life for an idea, and in doing so, had become a monster. The world was a swirling vortex of orange and black, a living nightmare. And in the center of it, Clarabelle was perfectly still, a hollowed-out shell of a woman. The fire could take her now. It would be a mercy, a quick end to a grief so vast it had no name. She closed her eyes, waiting for the heat to consume her, to scour her failure from the face of the earth. Time ceased to have meaning. There was only the roar, the heat, and the crushing, silent scream in her soul. But death did not come. Instead, a new sensation pricked at the edges of her awareness. A smell, not just the acrid smoke of pine, but something else, the damp, loamy scent of overturned earth. She opened her eyes. The world swam back into focus, a hellscape painted in shades of charcoal and ember. And there, inches from her face, pressed into the gray ash covering the ground, was a shape. A perfect, crescent-shaped indentation. A hoofprint. It was Tobias's. She knew the size, the specific wear of it, as well as she knew the lines on her own hand. Her gaze followed it. There was another, and another. A clear, deliberate trail, leading not in a panicked, random direction, but north, toward the ravine he had chosen. He hadn't bolted, he had walked. Something shifted in the frozen landscape of her despair. It was not hope. Hope was a fragile, delicate thing, and there was no room for it in this desolation. This was something else, something harder and more primal. A refusal, a denial of the verdict she had just passed on herself. She didn't know if they were alive. The odds were impossibly, laughably small. But the tracks were there. They were a question mark in a world of periods. They were a direction. She had sentenced herself to death, but her body refused to carry out the sentence. Her duty was not to die in the ashes of her failure, but to follow it, to see it through to its bitter, terrible end. If her daughter's body lay somewhere in that burning ravine, she would find it. It was a penance, a pilgrimage of grief. With a groan that seemed to rise from the very center of the earth, she pushed herself up. Her muscles screamed, her burns throbbed, but the physical pain was a distant echo of the gaping wound in her soul. She looked at the strongbox, lying inert in the dust. The future. It meant nothing now. Then she looked at the trail of hoofprints, disappearing into the swirling curtain of smoke and embers. That was the only thing that mattered. The past, the present, the infinitesimal chance. She left the box where it lay. She took a staggering step, then another, her eyes fixed on the trail. Her hope had been reduced to this, following the footprints of a donkey into the heart of the inferno. It was a fool's errand, perhaps, but she was a fool who had nothing left to lose. And so she walked, a ghost haunting the ruins of her own life, into the burning, crackling dark. The world inside the ravine was a different kind of hell. Here, the fire was not a rolling wave, but a vertical, suffocating presence. The tall cottonwoods that lined the gully had become giant, hissing torches, their bark peeling away in glowing sheets, their leaves turned to a rain of fireflies that died before they hit the ground. The air was thick with the sweet, sickening smell of boiling sap and the sharp, mineral tang of superheated rock. Embers, some as large as a man's fist, drifted down like malevolent snow, catching in Clarabelle's hair and scorching her dress. She moved in a crouch, her head bowed, her entire universe narrowed to the next hoofprint in the ash. The trail was her scripture, her only guide in this collapsing cathedral of flame. Tobias had chosen well. The fire was worse on the ridges above, and the ravine offered a channel for the smoke to rise, creating a barely breathable layer of air near the ground. But it was still a death trap, a corridor of immense heat and falling debris. Her body was a symphony of pain. The blisters on her hands had broken, leaving raw, weeping flesh. Every breath was a fresh agony, every step a monumental effort of will. But she barely noticed. Her physical suffering was a dim, far-away thing, completely eclipsed by the singular, burning question that drove her forward. Was Mercy alive? The question pulsed with every beat of her heart, with every falling ember. With every step she expected to find it, a scorched blanket, a toppled form, the confirmation of her failure. But the tracks continued, steady and sure, a testament to the donkey's unbelievable calm. He hadn't run, he had walked. He had picked his way through this apocalypse with a purpose that defied all reason. Then she heard it. Over the ceaseless roar and crackle of the fire, a sound so incongruous, so impossible that she thought her mind had finally broken. A bray. A long, drawn-out, desperate hee-haw that cut through the din. It wasn't the sound of panic, but a call, a signal. It came from somewhere ahead, deeper in the smoke. "Tobias!" she screamed, her voice ripping through her ravaged throat. The sound was swallowed almost immediately, but she didn't care. She began to run, stumbling, falling to her knees, pushing herself back up, her eyes straining to pierce the swirling gray veil ahead. "Mercy!" The bray came again, closer this time, and she homed in on it, a lifeline of sound in the chaos. She scrambled over a fallen, glowing log, the heat searing through the soles of her boots. And then she saw them. Through a momentary parting in the smoke, a silhouette. The unmistakable shape of a donkey standing near the edge of the creek that ran through the bottom of the ravine. And on his back, a small, blanket-wrapped bundle. The relief was so sudden, so total, it was a physical blow. It punched the air from her lungs and sent her collapsing to the ashen ground. They were alive. He had done it. The stubborn, steady old donkey had done it. He had brought his precious cargo to the water. A flood of hysterical, choking laughter mixed with sobs escaped her. She crawled the last few feet, her body shaking uncontrollably. Tobias turned his head as she approached. He looked exhausted, his shaggy coat matted with soot and dotted with glowing embers that he seemed not to notice. But his eyes were the same, dark, calm, and impossibly deep. He nudged her with his nose, a soft, encouraging push. Clarabelle reached up, her burned hands clumsy and trembling, and touched the swaddled form of her daughter. She pulled back the flap of wool. Mercy's face was smudged with soot, her brow furrowed in a frown of mild annoyance. But she was breathing. Her eyes opened, and those two chips of perfect blue looked up at Clarabelle, not with terror, but with a kind of sleepy confusion. She was alive. She was unharmed. Clarabelle buried her face in the blanket, the rough wool scratching her cheek, and wept. She wept for her own monstrous doubt, for her foolishness, for the miracle she held in her hands. She wept with a gratitude so profound it felt like its own form of pain. But their reunion was brief, their sanctuary an illusion. A deafening crack echoed through the ravine as a massive cottonwood on the far side of the creek, its roots burned through, gave a final shudder, and crashed into the water, sending a plume of steam and scalding water into the air. The fire was closing in. They were trapped in the gully, with flames now raging on both sides. The creek was their only escape route. It wasn't wide, perhaps 20 feet across, but it was swollen and fast with early autumn runoff, its surface a churning, muddy torrent. And it was their only way out. The fire would sweep down this ravine and incinerate everything in its path within minutes. Clarabelle's mind, once frozen with despair, was now sharp with adrenaline. There was no time. She looked at Mercy, then at the churning water, then at Tobias. There was only one way. She had trusted him once, out of desperation. Now she had to trust him again, out of faith. "All right, boy," she said, her voice steady now, resolute. She checked the straps holding Mercy, cinching them one last time. She patted his strong neck. "One more time. Take her across. Go now. Straight across." She pointed to the opposite bank, a steep, muddy incline that offered the only egress from the gully. "Go!" She gave his rump a firm shove. Tobias didn't hesitate. He stepped into the creek, the water immediately swirling around his sturdy legs. He braced himself against the current, his head low, his hooves finding purchase on the rocky, uneven bottom. The water deepened, rising to his belly, then to his chest. He was a beast of burden, built for stability, for carrying weight. The precious bundle on his back remained high and dry. He moved with a slow, powerful determination, a gray island of resolve in the chaotic water. Burning branches hissed and spat as they fell into the creek around him, and the roar of the fire was a physical pressure, but he did not falter. Clarabelle watched, her heart in her throat, her hands clasped in a prayer. She watched as he fought the current, his muscles straining, until his front hooves finally found purchase on the muddy slope of the far bank. He scrambled, digging in, and pulled himself and his cargo out of the water, shaking his great body and sending a shower of droplets into the smoky air. He had done it. He was across. He was safe. Mercy was safe. Now it was her turn. As she prepared to enter the water, a thought, sharp and insistent, struck her. The strongbox, she had left it, left their future, their history, everything James had worked for, to be consumed by the fire. She had made the right choice then, the choice for life. But now, Mercy was safe on the other side. Could she save the rest of it too? Could she preserve not just their lives, but their life? It was a mad impulse. The fire was closer, the heat more intense. But the image of James's face, his pride in their small stake, flashed in her mind. She turned and ran, back into the gully, back toward the smoldering ruin of the cabin. She was no longer just a mother. She was a protector of a legacy, however small. She found it where she had dropped it, half buried in ash, its iron surface warm to the touch. It was so heavy, so impossibly, stupidly heavy. Clutching it to her chest with both arms, she staggered back to the creek's edge. Her arms screamed, her lungs burned. The weight of it threatened to pull her under before she even started. She waded in. The cold shock of the water was a brief reprieve, but the current was strong, tugging at her legs, trying to pull her feet from under her. The heavy box was an anchor, dragging her down. She held it high, her chin tilted up to keep her mouth out of the water. Halfway across, a burning log crashed into the water upstream, sending a wave surging toward her. It slammed into her, and she lost her footing. She went under, the muddy water filling her mouth and nose, the weight of the box pulling her to the bottom. For a second, she considered letting it go. Just let it sink, save herself. But she couldn't. She clung to it, a testament to her stubborn will to preserve every piece of their life. Kicking wildly, she fought her way back to the surface, sputtering and gasping. Her feet found the rocky bottom again. She pushed on, step by agonizing step, her entire being focused on the opposite bank, where the donkey stood like a silent, patient sentinel, guarding the child he had saved. Finally, her knees hit the mud of the bank. She crawled, dragging the box with her, inch by painful inch, out of the water's grasp, collapsing onto the ground, exhausted, soaked, but victorious. She had done it. She had brought them all through the fire. The cave was a womb of cool, damp silence. Tobias had found it, a shallow limestone opening tucked under a rocky overhang, hidden by a curtain of ancient ivy that the fire miraculously had only singed. Inside, the world of flame and roaring sound ceased to exist. There was only the drip of water from the stone ceiling, a slow, steady metronome marking the passage of time, and the soft, rhythmic sound of breathing. Clarabelle had carefully unstrapped Mercy from the donkey's back, her hands gentle as she unwrapped the soot-stained blankets. She had cleaned her daughter's face with a strip of her own petticoat dipped in the cool, clear water that pooled in a basin of rock. Now, Mercy slept peacefully in a small nest of blankets, her chest rising and falling in the deep, untroubled rhythm of infancy. Her survival was a miracle so profound it felt holy, a sacred truth in the heart of the devastation. Clarabelle sat with her back against the cool stone wall, her body a map of pain. Her burns throbbed with a dull, insistent fire of their own, and every muscle ached with an exhaustion so deep it felt cellular. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the frantic, screaming panic in her mind was gone, replaced by a vast, quiet stillness. Tobias stood near the mouth of the cave, a stoic guardian, his silhouette framed against the smoke-choked gray light of the outside world. He had not sought to graze or wander. He simply stood watch. He had transcended his role as a beast of burden. He was no longer just Tobias the donkey. He was Tobias the savior. He was the wise, steady heart that had guided them through the apocalypse. A wave of gratitude, pure and overwhelming, washed over Clarabelle. She looked at the old, steady animal, and her understanding of the world shifted on its axis. She had been raised with the firm belief of man's dominion over the beasts of the field, of their utility and their otherness. But the loyalty and courage she had witnessed challenged that comfortable human-centric view. It wasn't instinct that had guided him. It was something more, a bond, a trust that she had placed in him, and that he had returned 100-fold. The strongbox sat beside her, its iron form cold and solid in the gloom. It represented the future, the practical world of deeds and coins. She had risked her life for it. But as she looked from the box to her sleeping child, to the steadfast donkey, she realized its true value. It wasn't the foundation of their future, it was merely a tool. The true foundation was here, in this cave. It was this unbreakable circle of trust forged between a woman, a child, and an animal. This was the thing to be rebuilt. Dawn came not as a burst of light, but as a slow, reluctant dilution of the darkness. The crimson glow of the fire had faded, replaced by a sickly, uniform gray. Clarabelle crept to the mouth of the cave and looked out. The world was gone. The vibrant living green of the valley, the deep umber of the forest floor, the azure of the sky, all of it had been erased. In its place was an alien landscape of black and gray. Skeletal trees, stark and brittle, clawed at a sky the color of ash. The ground was a uniform carpet of soot, punctuated by the ghostly white of incinerated rock. The silence was absolute, the profound, deafening silence of a world without birdsong, without the rustle of leaves, without life. It was a wound on the face of the earth, and they were at its center. Despair, A familiar old friend tried to whisper at the edges of her newfound peace, but she pushed it away. They were alive. That was the only truth that mattered. Late in the afternoon, they heard voices, men calling out. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced Clarabelle's exhaustion. She stumbled from the cave, waving her arms, her voice a raw croak. "Here! We're here!" A small group of riders appeared over the blackened crest of the ravine, their forms stark against the gray sky. Silas Ward was in the lead, his face a mask of grim resignation, assuming the worst. When he saw her, his expression shifted to one of stunned disbelief. He spurred his horse forward, sliding to a stop before her. "Clarabelle! By God, we saw the cabin! We thought—" His words trailed off as his gaze fell upon the mouth of the cave, where Tobias stood, and then to the bundle she now held in her arms. The other men gathered, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and awe. They looked from the living woman and child to the utter devastation surrounding them, the equation not making sense. Clarabelle, in a voice scraped raw by smoke and emotion, told them the story. She told them of the choice, of strapping Mercy to the donkey, of the race for the strongbox, of following the tracks into the fire, of the harrowing creek crossing. She spoke of Tobias not as an animal, but as a hero. The men listened in silence, their hardened, practical faces softened by the sheer impossibility of her tale. They looked at the old, soot-covered donkey standing guard by the cave with a new, profound respect. He was no longer livestock. He was a legend. The journey back to Silas Ward's homestead was a slow, somber procession through the dead world. They carried her and Mercy, but Tobias walked alongside, unled, his place by their side unquestioned. It was 2 days later that the lookout Silas had posted on the ridge came riding in at a gallop. A lone rider was approaching from the east. Clarabelle's heart stopped, then began to beat with a wild, painful rhythm. It was James. The reunion was not one of joyful cries, but of a quiet, desperate collision. He swung himself from his horse before it had even stopped, his face haggard with fear, having ridden through the smoke-filled horizon for days, imagining the absolute worst. He saw the blackened ridges, and his world had ended. And then he saw her, standing there, alive. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, his body shaking with the force of his relief. He held her as if he might never let go, as if she were a ghost he was trying to hold in the mortal world. Tears streamed down both their faces, tears of grief for what was lost, and of overwhelming, shattering gratitude for what had been saved. He knelt and touched Mercy's cheek with a trembling finger, his gaze then finding Tobias, who stood nearby, watching the scene with his calm, dark eyes. Silas had told him the story, and James, a practical man not given to sentiment, looked at the donkey with an expression of pure, unadulterated reverence. They rebuilt, not in the same spot, but a little closer to the creek, where a few of the old cottonwoods had, against all odds, survived. The work was hard, felling fire-hardened timber, raising new walls against the coming winter. Neighbors came from miles around, bringing tools and food and labor, bound by the unwritten code of the frontier and by the power of Clarabelle's story, which had already passed into local lore. But their new life was different. The new cabin was a home, but the heart of their family had expanded. Tobias was never again put to a plow or laden with sacks of grain. He was retired from his life as a beast of burden. He had no corral. He roamed freely, a silent, watchful guardian who was never far from the cabin door, always with one eye on the small child he had carried through the fire. He was revered, a member of the family in the truest sense of the word. The story ends on a quiet evening, a year later. The sky is a gentle periwinkle, streaked with the soft pink of a peaceful sunset. The valley, though still scarred, is showing the first tender shoots of green. James sits on the porch of the new cabin, bouncing a laughing, babbling Mercy on his knee. Clarabelle stands leaning against a post, watching them, a soft smile on her face. The heavy iron strongbox sits inside, a reminder of the past, but no longer the anchor of their future. A few yards away, Tobias stands under the new leaves of a surviving cottonwood, his head lowered slightly, his long ears twitching at the sound of the baby's laughter. He is at peace, his duty done, his place secure. Clarabelle looks from her husband and child to the steadfast donkey, and she understands. Home is not a place you build with timber and nails. It is not a deed in an iron box. Home is a bond. It is a circle of trust you forge in fire, a quiet understanding that love and loyalty are not confined to human hearts. It is a thing you earn, one splinter, one scar, and one act of impossible faith at a time.